All right, today we're going to discuss open theism in the connection with the doctrine of God and in response to the classical theism which we have been examining. Now, when I left you last time, I asked you to think about how your doctrine of God affects how you pray. Because how we conceive of God, as I keep reminding you, has some very practical consequences. And one of those consequences, a really big one, is what we think is happening when we pray. So the response that we're going to examine today, which is open theism, did not come from great philosophical considerations and all of that. It wasn't just, let's examine classical theism in light of its philosophical assumptions. Rather, it arose from a very practical question of what happens when we pray. When we pray, is God moved by our prayers? Can God change his mind? And if God can change his mind, does that mean that he's not perfect? So you see how these things, but then why is it that I pray if I don't think that my prayers have any effect on God, or that he kind of stands or sits, or however you want to imagine that, in this kind of transcendent realm that is like Titian, untouched by the writhings of humanity below him? So that is really the heart of what brings about open theism, is really some very practical questions about what it means for God to be in relation to us, and what does it mean for us to really have human freedom? What kind of freedom do we have? What kind of freedom does God exercise in relation to us? All of these are brought up, and they are in many ways a response to classical theism. Now, I want to start with this quote by Peter Bales. At the heart of all our difficulties concerning Christian prayer is the problem of understanding the being of God in general and the relation of God to the world and to ourselves in particular. So that's really where I want to start today. The being of God, who God is, has implications for how we understand how he relates to this world. So let's go ahead and start with what is open theism. Now, open theism didn't try to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It is not, in its critique of classical theism, it's not trying to say none of this matters, we're going to throw it out, we're going to start from scratch. Rather, it seeks to kind of revise and redefine some of those terms that we were looking at in light of what they think is a more biblical conception of God rather than one informed by Greek philosophy. So, that means that where they end up, as we're going to see, and know that in many of the positions that we look at, whether we're looking at classical theism and open theism, it isn't always a matter of, I'm just going to jettison everything that's here. It's a matter of you critically examining the kind of fundamental assumptions that are being made and seeing, is where they land with those assumptions, does that make the most sense? Or can you take some of those assumptions and land somewhere else? And so it isn't always a matter of just jettisoning something. It's a matter of thinking about what are the strengths and weaknesses of these different positions. What do you want to pull out from those things to help build a better web of doctrine for yourself and for those to whom you're going to be ministering? All right. So now, one of the things to understand about open theism is that it most certainly does stand within orthodoxy. Now, I know some people, maybe even some people in this class, might not want to argue that, and there are certainly some evangelicals who have argued that they certainly don't belong in evangelicalism, and there are thinkers like John Piper who would just assume, see many of these views as heretical. And yet, when we look at things like the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed and even the Constantinople Creed and all those creeds, they're not dealing with some of the more controversial aspects of even more controversial aspects of open theism. That isn't what determines what orthodoxy is, in my opinion. So I think that in my opinion, they may scratch the guardrails a little bit that I told you about. What is it that orthodoxy is doing but helping us plunge over the edge? Orthodoxy just can't mean whatever it is that you want it to mean. It must have some guardrails that help us to understand what it is and what it isn't, right? So I think in some of these things we may be scraping the guardrails, but I'm probably in the camp of many other evangelicals who think they didn't quite go overboard. That said, there's certainly those who do think that, and what I will do is I will put on the website some of the texts of open theism, which you may want to look at, and then some of the responses to open theism, which you may want to look at in turn. Okay? But understand that this is a back and forth. Like many arguments that we present in this class, like many criticisms that we have, even as open theism critiques classical theism, a classical theist will have a response to open theists, and when classical theists criticize open theism, there are responses that open theism has. Okay, sorry about that. Whenever I get a phone call, even though it's on Do Not Disturb, for whatever reason, I found out it stops the video recording. So I'm going to get back to it. All right, so let's see. Now, what does open theism refer to? When it says open, what's open about it? Well, there are two things. One is the idea that God is open to the world. He's open to us, and he truly responds to us. The second is that the future is partially open, which means that it hasn't already been determined. Okay? So the future is partially open. Now, notice I said partially, not fully open, and that God is responsive to us. Those are the two things. Now, among the main proponents you're going to find Clark Pinnock, John Sanders, Gregory Boyd, John Polkinghorne, the physicist from Cambridge, who was the professor of physics at Cambridge, who's also an ordained minister, William Hasker, and others that fall strongly or have advocated for the open theist position. If you look at one of the first books that came out on open theism called The Openness of God, edited by Clark Pinnock, you're going to see that there's essays by a number of those people in that book explaining different aspects of open theism. I did mention that it is evangelical. Now, arguably so. Like I said, there are some like John Piper who would say, no, it's absolutely not. And wanted Clark Pinnock, for example, kicked out of the Evangelical Theological, I think, Association. I can't remember exactly what it was called. But it was voted that he stays. So that tells you that we're kind of pushing the envelope a little bit, but there's certainly some questions that are raised here. All right. Now, I did want to say a note about what it is not. It is, and if you know what this is, great. If you don't know what it is, don't worry about it. But there's something called process theology, which is kind of a more radical version of this, although it developed in its own right. It didn't develop because of open theism. It developed there's in its own kind of strand. But that process theology is largely philosophically driven. And what makes this kind of still in the Orthodox camp and what still kind of puts it in the evangelical camp is that it's firmly biblical. In other words, Pinnock and Boyd and others are looking to the biblical text to draw on their doctrine of God. So, and that is obviously a key element of evangelicalism. So, but when they look at the Bible, they may be looking, obviously they're looking at the same verse that a classical theist would be looking at, and yet they're coming out with different interpretations of those verses. And that doesn't always make it wrong. It's sometimes those views need to be questioned because we read certain things. It's like I said, sometimes we may think that we come to the Bible like a blank slate and then we just kind of read. But the reality is we come to the Bible already with something that is informing the way that we read. So certainly if you already come with let's say Calvinist determinist viewpoint, that's going to inform the way that you read particular verses. And the same thing is true of open theism. There are verses that you look at and you go, wow, I never thought that was the way that you could read that. Oh my gosh, you really can read it that way. So that's kind of a helpful thing that open theism is doing, is it's kind of like jolting us to think about very static ways that sometimes the biblical text has been read. And one of the things to also note is that they're taking an inductive approach to the Bible. That is, instead of like just proof texting everything, they're certainly looking at the Bible, but they're not kind of sitting there and drawing out a bunch of proof texts. Rather, in the inductive method, what they're doing is they're looking at specific observations that they see, specific stories that they see, specific interactions or verses that they see, and then they are drawing some broad principles from those specific observations. Now here at Fuller, we have people who fall in a range, and you have people that fall more in the classical theism range, and people that will fall, I won't say just in open theism, I don't know that they would call themselves open theists, but certainly have a less allegiance to the classical theism that's been so much part of our theology. Okay, so let's look at open theism's critique of classical theism. Now, classical theism understands God as the final cause of all that occurs. Okay, so, and that's what is meant by that is that ultimately God, everything, God is, whether or not God is the one who actually, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of an example that's not a terrible one, but God's not the one who actually maybe performs the action, but the fact is that He created. Ultimately, He's the cause, and that He's created well, I want to be careful because there's the reason I'm hesitating a little bit is because there's a whole spectrum of the way that we can see that causality and how direct that causality is. You can go all the way from a range where God has simply created the conditions for these things to happen, or you can look at it as God is much more determinative. That happened because God made it happen. Okay, so that's, anyway, it's questioning that degree of causality. Okay, and not in all things, but that's one of the things that OT is going to, that open theism is going to question. They believe that classical theism denies human freedom, especially in its Calvinistic form. So, and I'll just give you an example of the contemporary Calvinist theologian Gordon Clark, who would seem to take what I would call, in that range I was just trying to give you, of how directly does God cause something to happen. And in that extreme, where God determines everything that's going to happen, that God's the cause of everything, this is what he writes. I wish very frankly and pointedly to assert that if a man gets drunk and shoots his family, it was the will of God that he should do it. So you can see where that falls along the spectrum, right? And so we have what seems to have been a tension, but that we've had not only in Christianity, but in other religions as well, that give a lot of sovereignty to God, or attribute sovereignty to God, is how do we negotiate God's will and human freedom? And you can land in all kinds of places, and open theism says that classical theism has a tendency to land, maybe not as far as Gordon Clark does, but to see God as that ultimate cause. Now, I'm going to introduce something which is a side note here, all right? It's not open theism, but I thought this would be a good point to just say something about human freedom and the sovereignty of God. And to do that, I have included a short video by Jeremy Begbie, and you can look at it if you wish. It's called God and Freedom, and I can't remember exactly. I watched this video several times in the past, but I haven't watched it in the last week or two. But I can say that when we think of human freedom and God's sovereignty, sometimes it feels like we're thinking about it like a pie, right? There's a pie. The pie is a certain size. So the more of the pie that is God, the less that human freedom the less human freedom we have. All right. So that's one way of looking at it. But I don't think that's a very biblical way of looking at things, because it seems that God has really, truly given us human freedom, and yet God is divinely sovereign. So how do we put those things together? And I think that not always does more of God mean less of us. And the example that one of the examples Jeremy uses, and I don't know if I think he might use it in here, which is why I decided to use his video, is of a piano, right? When you have a piano and you hit like a C on one, like down here, it causes the other C in another register to ring. Now, the way that he talks about this is the more that this rings down here, the more that it frees the other note to be more fully itself. It's not like it swallows the other note. It actually allows the other note to ring out more truly and more clearly. And I think that is a better example, a better way of thinking about God's sovereignty and interaction with free will than thinking of it as a pie. Okay, so I just wanted to say that was a bracket. In no way is Jeremy Begbie an open theist, but I thought what he says about human freedom and God's sovereignty is helpful as you try to negotiate your way through some of these questions. Okay, all right. So, as I said, in that more extreme example, God causes all things, including human acts. And I don't think that that's where many people fall. I don't think that they fall on that end of the spectrum. As I said, it's a tendency that open theism is critiquing in classical theism. Okay, so let's look first at the understanding of God in open theism, and then we can look to some of the more controversial aspects of it. The first thing to understand is they put a lot of stress on what we call relational theism. Okay? That is to say that God truly is personal and relational in himself, and is truly personal and relational in the way that he engages with us. So rather than an absolutist perspective of God, there's a strong emphasis on that Trinitarian communion of persons. Now, along with that is the idea that in order for there to be a genuine, to be an authentic reciprocal relationship, means that God in some way has to make space for human freedom. Now, a way to think about this is not that God isn't sovereign and omnipotent. It is rather that in his choice, in his omnipotence, he voluntarily limits himself to create a space for genuine human freedom to be exercised. That doesn't mean that God couldn't have done it differently, but in his sovereignty, in his omnipotence, he chooses to do it in this way, so that he can have a free human response in this reciprocal relationship. Okay? Now, of course, as you would expect, that means that open theists strongly underscore God's primary characteristic of love because of that relational aspect. And one of the ways in thinking about who God is and who God is for us is to think about God as a loving parent, okay? And a loving parent has obviously intentions for their children, right? Oh, by the way, my dog keeps coming up, so let me introduce you to my dog. Come here, Samson. Up, 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 up. He doesn't want to come up. Oh, there he goes. All right, this is Samson. Yes, and he is my co-creator in these lectures, and that he gently encourages me as I'm working and makes sure that I still play. So that's Samson. Say hi. Okay. All right, enough about Samson. Anyway, you'll hear him from time to time, and you'll probably see him from time to time walking around. All right. So back to the idea of a loving parent. A loving parent doesn't try to determine everything that's going to happen, right? A loving parent even may sometimes step back, in fact, must step back, to allow their child the freedom of autonomy to be themselves and to make choices that you wouldn't necessarily as a parent want them to make, but realize that that autonomy is key. Otherwise, it becomes manipulative, right? So, so while not everything happens that you want to happen as a parent, and you may guide, you may do other things, and you're certainly going to intervene in certain situations, but at the same time, you're going to allow some space for your child to develop, to some autonomy for your child to truly develop, so that that child in their freedom grows, flourishes, and has relationship with you. Okay? So, all right, so God is loving parent. Now, sorry, my eyes are starting to go as I get a little bit older. Now, so that means, as I mentioned before, that authentic human freedom has been granted to us in God's sovereignty. But I want you to note something here. One is, two things. One, God is exercising his sovereignty in doing this. He could do it otherwise, but in his sovereignty, this is the way he's chosen to do it. So this is not an inherent limitation on God to do this. It is an exercise of his sovereignty that allows us to have the freedom. The second is that it's limited freedom. All right, so we're not omnipotent like God is. We're not omnicompetent. We're not any of those things, but we're rather, it's not that God is never going to intervene. It's not that God is not, everything is just whatever we determine is going to happen. Rather, he's given us some space for true freedom to occur. Okay? All right. So, what this means is that in his exercise of his divine sovereign freedom, he has made some of his actions. So here's the thing now that starts to get a little interesting, is that it's not just our actions that are affected. It's that God, because he's truly responding to us, makes some of his own actions contingent on what we do. Now notice I said some, not all. And secondly, this is an exercise of his freedom to allow this to happen. So in other words, we're going to start moving towards that more controversial aspect, but we haven't gotten there yet, of the fact that God truly responds to us. It's not a fake response, it's not a pretend response, but that God, when we plead with him, let's say in prayer, and let's say that there was a certain course of action that was going to be taken by God, or that was going to happen, when we pray, God may change his mind or change his plans in response to our prayers. Okay, so some of you might get the EWGBs, but no, God is changeless, and his plans are perfect. Well, it depends on what you mean by perfection. Do you think of perfection as something which is static, or do you think it's something more dynamic? Which gives God more freedom? That there's only one way that things can be done, so God is limited by that one thing, or that God is endlessly resourceful, as open theists say, and that he can still have an ultimate will for his creation and bring that about, but that at the same time, he is so omnipotent that he's able to truly work with us and allow us to truly influence some of the things that he does. So it goes back to that idea of changelessness. Does changelessness mean that God isn't perfect? Well, we have to look at the reverse implication of that. Does that mean that God is static? That nothing that happens, that everything is just something static? Or do we see something more dynamic and relational in the biblical text? And that's what open theists are trying to help us to understand. To rethink not changelessness in terms of God cannot change his mind, because that reciprocal relationship means that in some things God may very well be influenced by what we do. But God is truly changeless in his nature. So God is faithful, God is just, God is merciful, God is love, God is all of these things, right? By the way, those are all very strongly relational ways of thinking of God, about God. God is all of these things in his nature, and that does not change. God will not become something other than who he is. But the way he engages with his creation allows for a more dynamic interaction than what it appears that classical theism allows. Okay, so far so good? All right. Read some of the articles. Maybe that will help you. So what that means, now, here's the other thing to understand. I underlined certain words because they were important words that I wanted you to consider. I said that in some things, God can change his mind. To understand how this works is to understand God's not like some wishy-washy, like I can just be changed by the winds of whatever is blowing. God himself is the most powerful actor here. He's the one with the vision. He's the one who's the creator. He's the one who's made everything the way it is. He knows where he's taken his creation. So God can and does unilaterally act. Has nothing to do with our response. God is going to act and he's going to do certain things. What open theism is saying, though, is that there are some things which God has opened himself to being responsive to. And if you go back to that loving parent, picture, there are some things that as a parent, this is what you're going to do. But there are certain things in which you will open yourself to being influenced by your children. Okay, so, all right. Now, so what does that mean in terms of, let me see, God's omniscience and God's omnipotence? It means that God is still omnipotent, God is still omniscient, but they're going to redefine those terms from the way that classical theism has understood that. So instead of seeing God as the cause of all things, they're going to look at it in a much more dynamic, relational way than the kind of more Greek philosophical understandings of immutability, changelessness, and perfection, and all of that. Okay? Now, so what this means is that in God's sovereign freedom, he's allowed his actions to be contingent upon our actions and requests. So, for example, he really does listen, like in Exodus 32:14, when Moses is pleading for Israel. Or, for example, let's say when Abraham is pleading for Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And now, there's a couple of things that are happening there. Or, well, you can read that, as some might, and say, oh, God knew all along what was going to happen, and he was just playing with Abraham or trying to make Abraham feel better. He was just going along with Abraham. Or you could say he really was listening to Abraham, and when Abraham said, hey, if I can find 50, I can't remember what the exact number is that going to be enough people that you would save the city? And, it's either God is going, oh, I know where this is going, and yeah, I'll just humor Abraham. Or he's really considering, yeah, you know what, if there's 50, I will save the city. Until Abraham gets down to such a ridiculously low number that clearly the city has to go. Anyway, so now that also means, for example, that there is not a single plan of God that happens no matter what. And if some divine perfect plan that you are going to fit into. Now, does that mean God doesn't have plans for us? That doesn't mean that at all. It means that God can have plans for us, but how those come about, and if they come about, are in some way dependent on us. Okay? So, what that means is at first it will go, but oh my gosh, I don't want anything to be dependent on me, because that means that I could really blow it and God has a perfect plan for me. Or there's lots of ways that you can look at this. But another way of seeing that is to understand God's plans cannot be derailed because of human response. He can still engage in free human response, but in his endless resourcefulness, there are many ways in which something can come about. There are many possibilities, And it doesn't have to be what we call meticulous providence, which is something that you'll find in Calvinism, that God is engaged in every single little aspect, but rather what they call general providence, which is that God has this general care that he has, things in the bigger picture terms, and he may even sometimes have act in a meticulous way. It doesn't preclude that, but in generally speaking, God exercises general providence, which means he's not manipulating the way that everything is going to happen. That he's not saying, that parking space opened up because I created that parking space to open up, although it's always possible that he did. So it's just not saying that it happened because everything was predetermined by God for it to happen. So it's obviously, it's not a deterministic perspective. It's a much less deterministic perspective. It's a much more open perspective on possibilities. But that doesn't have to sound scary, because the good thing about that is, oh my gosh, what if I made a left instead of a right? And God's plan was that I should make a left, but I made a right. Oh no. Well, the way that open theism would look at it is God is still involved, and God is endlessly resourceful, so that whatever experience that you have in turning to the right can still be incorporated into the will that God has, this general providence and this plan, this big plan that God has for his creation, without him determining every single aspect of how that plan is going to come about. And by the way, I'm not saying that God doesn't have a plan for you. I'm not saying that. It's just that how you imagine what that means is what is being challenged here. Okay? So I believe very strongly I had a supernatural experience that pulled me away. I have a degree in economics. I was going to do something completely different. I had an extraordinary experience of God, in which God called me into what I do now. Now, obviously, that was a calling by God. That there is a plan, so to speak. Now, is every single aspect of that plan meticulously, so that every single thing that happens because God wills it? If I applied to Cambridge and Oxford, but God meant for me to, okay, now I'm going to leave it at that. Boy, we could run down this rabbit hill, and I realize I don't have time to follow that rabbit hill. I said rabbit hole. I don't have time to go down into that hole, into that place. But the point is that not to think that God doesn't have plans, but an open theist would see that not in a meticulous fashion where God controls every single aspect of that, but in a wider way in which God exercises his plan for creation, maybe even his plan for you, in a way that's much more dynamic, in which there's movement within that based on what you do. Okay, so, all right. Now, there certainly seems to be some. So let's take, for example, the way that an open theist would look, for example, at the midwife's response to Pharaoh's command to kill all the baby boys, right? From an open theist perspective, it may be that the midwives would have followed Pharaoh out of fear instead of God, but they followed God and things went this particular way. From the open theist perspective, they had the human freedom to be able to follow Pharaoh. And if they had, God would have had a plan B and a plan C and a plan D, because he's endlessly resourceful, and he will bring about his what he wills in some things, not in all things. Some things are still open, as we're going to find out. But those things which he really wills and wants to bring about, he can bring about, because he's endlessly resourceful in doing that. So if the midwives had not obeyed, it still would have happened. And then another example that John Sanders would give would be, for example, when Moses says, "No way am I going back to Egypt. I can't speak. I can't do anything." Now, who's to say that God would have gone, "Well, Moses, I chose you. I will give you the words that you need to speak." But Moses, in his free response, says, "No, I don't want to do that. I'm a terrible public speaker." And then so he says, well, then I will give you Aaron, right, to speak. So, so there you go. It's that in an open theist perspective, having Aaron speak might have been plan B, okay, to plan A. All right. So just trying to get you an idea of what it is that they're saying. Now, there certainly seem to be biblical pointers that say God is truly responsive to his to this world, and that they're not simply pulling things out. There seems to be many indicators that God truly responds in a fashion. Now, I know what a classic theist would say, well, God knew what was going to happen and he just looked like he was responding. But he wasn't really, because he knew what was going to happen anyway. Okay? But from a standpoint of if we didn't take that position, we could very well read the Bible in that more responsive, dynamic way. For example, God seems to regret in 1 Samuel 15:35. How can he regret if he had already predetermined the outcome? God asks questions in Hosea, for example, 8:5. God confronts unexpected results. Let's look at, for example, Isaiah 5:2-4. And he seems to allow that what it is that we do may affect his own timetable. See, for example, 2 Peter 3:12. There are actually a gazillion examples. It really is a matter of how we come to the text. All right? What's informing our reading of the text? So a couple other things about the doctrine of God, which that open theists hold in the next slide, is God is omnicompetent. That is what I meant by endlessly resourceful. That's not one of the omnis that was in classical theism, but it is an omni of open theism, which means not only is God all-powerful, he is omnicompetent. He is endlessly resourceful to bring about in this dynamic relationship what he wills. Okay? So, Pinnock talks about this as not the immutability of not in the context of the immutability of classical theism, but rather that God exercises his faithfulness, and he is unchanging in terms of his faithfulness to us. But how he is going to bring things about, that is changeable. Okay? So God is faithful and constant in his character and nature, but it doesn't mean that God can't change his mind or work with our genuine and free responses to him. And that God is therefore flexible in reaction to certain events. Okay? All right. Now, there's one more thing I'm going to just quickly touch on, and that is God and time. Now remember, in classical theism, God is timeless. And that has been conceived by Augustine and others as somehow outside time. Well, that does create some problems, doesn't it? One, how do we understand God's involvement with his creation if he's completely outside of time? How do we understand the incarnation if God is completely outside of time? If he sees all things perfectly past, present, and future? And this is one of the things that's going to be challenged by open theists. It's not so much timelessness in the sense that God is outside time, but rather that whatever God's relationship is to time, it somehow God does relate in some way to our conception. Because if he didn't, even the very categories or concerning God wouldn't even be available to our way of thinking. There's got to be a genuine connection here in which God is engaged with his creation in a way that's not so outside that we have no way of relating, or else we can't even really talk about God in a meaningful way. So that takes us to the most controversial aspect. And you're thinking, wait, I was already thinking that this was controversial. The most controversial aspect of open theism regards God's foreknowledge. What does he know? What doesn't he know? And in classical theism, basically God exhaustively knows everything that's happened past, present, and future. So God knows everything that's going to happen. And my guess is that for many of you, this is what you've understood. Open theism is going to affirm the exhaustive foreknowledge of God in terms of past and present, but say God does not exercise or have, it's not exercise, he does not have exhaustive foreknowledge of the future. And this is what John Sanders terms dynamic omniscience. Now remember that from the open theist perspective, they're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but they are redefining these terms like omniscience and omnipotence in light of, give me a second here, my poor dog needs some attention. I'm going to throw him there we go. But they're going to redefine those terms in what they believe is a more biblical fashion than classical theism has. Of course, that's debated, but especially in regards to this particular concept. So let's kind of break this down a little bit. And so, as I said, this is the most controversial of open theism's assertion. This is basically the idea. God knows all that can be known given the kind of world he has created. And God can certainly imagine the trajectories for what's going to happen in the future. But they believe that in terms of what God is going to will to happen, those things will be known. That's why the future is partially open, not fully open. So it's not as if God is powerless and he's just, whatever like I said, the winds will blow whichever way they will, and God has to blow by those winds. No, God is still the primary actor here. He's the one who's the most powerful of the actors. The difference is that in terms of what's going to happen in the future, there are certain things that God hasn't determined that are going to happen. And in those things, he doesn't know what is going to happen. Now, he can be a pretty darn good guesser because of the level of omniscience he has. But they believe that if you say God already knows everything that's going to happen, then in some way God is controlling the future, and that will detract from human freedom. So now, so that's basically the idea that's behind this. So in the sense then, the future is partially open, and God's knowledge of that future then is also partial, because those things which God has left open to be influenced by us, in those things, God doesn't know how we're going to react. He may have a pretty good idea of how we're going to react because he knows us so well. Just like you may know your child super, super well, and so you have a pretty good idea of how that child is going to interact or what's going to happen, but you won't know until that child actually performs that action. Well, the thing is, God knows us very thoroughly, so he can have a pretty good idea of that, but he is in no way determining what is going to happen, right? So God's controlling what's going to happen in the future, except for those things that he himself acts on, because God's fully in control of his own actions, right? So if God determines this is what's going to happen, this is how I'm going to have the incarnation. That's been in my mind for eternity. I'm going to this is the telos that I have for this creation. Those things, they're going to happen. One, God is the primary actor in those things, and those are things which God has unilaterally decided are going to happen. Therefore, they will happen. Okay? But like I said, there are some things that God has genuinely left contingent upon our own actions. So in correspondence to that, in terms of his omniscience, God does not know for sure how I'm going to decide a certain action until it happens. Therefore, when God is having his conversation with Abraham, that is a real back and forth that's happening. When God decides that Moses will be saved, for example, he doesn't know how the midwives are going to react, right? He doesn't know that in advance from the open theist perspective. But he's ready to still bring about his purposes because of his endless resourcefulness. Okay. So, so the future is partly definite, all right, and it's partly definite. That is, it's partly closed because what God can and will bring about unilaterally. But on the other hand, there are some parts which are indefinite, which are open, that are contingent on what will happen on us. So they have gone from that idea of contingency to carrying that one step forward to what God knows and what God doesn't know in the future. So this is what John Sanders writes. God is not caught off guard, since he has foresight, anticipating what we will do. Also, hold on one second, it is not the case that just anything may happen, for God has acted in history to bring about events in order to achieve his unchanging purpose. Graciously, however, God invites us to collaborate with him to bring the open part of the future into being. And as part of that, he will not know what that will be until it actually happens. You cannot know what cannot be known, is how open theism puts it. So, all right. Now, I'm trying to think because I think I wrote something in here that I thought would be helpful. Oh, it was somewhere else. You know, the way I think of this is that collaboration, the idea that God has graciously invited us into collaboration with him. I think a picture that we can use is there's different ways that you can conceive what God is doing. You can either conceive it as a book, which has already been written, and you just read the book as it is, okay? Or you can conceive of it as a play in which the author of the play has allowed for improvisation by the actors in the play. So think about this. In this case, God is not only the author of the play, he's also probably, you might say, he's the main actor in the play. But, so there's certainly a direction that the play is going to take. At the same time, he's allowed for some degree of improvisation to which he will react as that actor within the play. So he's not only, so in a sense, the play is, yes, you're moving it towards a particular end, but how it gets there is something which is dynamically created in the improvisation between the actors that are part of that play, so that the playwright, God, has given that general framework, but it's not an exact blueprint. It's not a chapter by chapter reading of the book. It is more dynamic than that. So you might think of it, I don't know if that helps you at all, but that's the idea. So open theism then rejects that notion of exhaustive divine foreknowledge, which we see in the traditional understanding, which has sometimes been coupled with, like that quote I gave you from the extreme determinist perspective, is often coupled with God's foreordination of all things, right? So basically, they've taken that idea of that dynamic back and forth and extended it one step forward into whether or not God knows the future. And that is the area that is probably the most critiqued of open theism. Okay? Now, open theism, I'm not going to get into what middle knowledge is. That's a whole other philosophical lecture or theological lecture. But it rejects middle knowledge. Middle knowledge is basically, and I'm really oversimplifying this, it's basically the idea that God knows, God has a comprehensive knowledge of the future. He is not the one who is, it's not that he is bringing everything about, right? He's not the one who's manipulating everything to happen, but he knows what's going to happen. So, open theists still aren't happy with that because they still think that there is an aspect of it not being genuinely free in that if you take that perspective. However, personally, I think that middle knowledge has some really brilliant proponents, such as William Craig, and that is where a lot of people land, where they're trying to still negotiate that idea between divine freedom divine sovereignty and human free will. So, as I wrote here, middle knowledge is that God has a comprehensive knowledge of the future and knows what people will freely do. Okay? But for open theists, if God knows what will be done, he will guide the world and plan everything that will occur. So therefore, there's no risk to God. And and from the open theist perspective, relationship entails risk. That means that things won't always turn out the way that you want them to turn out. And for John Sanders and others, that they talk about this as a divine vulnerability. In God's sovereignty, he has opened himself up in this vulnerability to take that risk, okay? To allow us to be truly free so that we can do things which he would not wish to happen. Now, I'm not sure if middle knowledge really contravenes that. That's something that if you're interested, you can explore for yourself. That goes back and forth, and open theists do think it does. And I'm just not going to pull that apart at this point in time. So anyway, on that note, I thought you might find it interesting. By no means do you have to watch this, but I found an open theism debate with James White, who takes the traditional view, with Bob Enyart, who's going to take an open view. And you're going to see that there's a particular slant, but I still think that it's that obviously the moderator is taking. But I think you might still find the debate itself and the responses to be of some interest. By no means, it's not assigned. I just put it there for you. All right. As I said, there's been quite a lot of dialogue and a critique back and forth. One of those critiques has been Bruce Ware's on Sanders' philosophy of time, and which is also related to God's omniscience. And I just thought I would go ahead and read Sanders' response because it kind of illustrates the open theist view. Ware claims that the open view makes God ignorant of many beliefs. Again, this is false. If the future conditionals do not exist, then there is nothing about which to be ignorant. To be ignorant of nothing is not to be ignorant. Perfect knowledge does not include knowing what is inherently unknowable. That is, God doesn't know certain things until they actually happen, like our responses. Okay. Ware seems to assume the B theory of time, whereby the future already exists, and that is the basic critique of open theism. The standpoint that the future in some sense already exists. It's already set in some way. That's why they find that threatening to human freedom. So in that sense, Super Bowl has already existed. Yes, that's right. I can't read Roman numerals that go that high. It is real now. Yes, somehow I missed that part of my upbringing when I was growing up. I'm fine until I get to the number 40 and then it all falls apart. Okay, Clark Pinnock. Just a few words about what he says. Unchangeable faithful. He likes to think, as I mentioned before, in terms of unchangeable faithfulness rather than immutability, as we have seen in classical theism. So he thinks more along the terms of divine sovereignty as sharing power. What he means is that in God's sovereignty, God has chosen to share some of the power for the outcomes with us. That doesn't make God less sovereign, because that's what God chose to do in his sovereignty. It's not for them, for Clark Pinnock and others, it's not a threat to God's sovereignty when God in his sovereignty chooses this way of doing things. And the other is that God is dynamic and not static, as we see in the shared dynamic relationships of love in the Trinity. So again, in terms of the attributes of God, it's not a refutation of all the classical attributes, but it's a reinterpretation. All right, and it's also a stress on certain attributes that classical theism didn't tend to stress, such as God's as relational, personal, and loving and good. Okay, now let's look at some of the contributions of open theism and then some of the critiques. I'm going to go over this fairly quickly because I think that in your mind you probably have already started to formulate some of these. All right, in terms of one theologian, Millard Erickson, I think he has been very fair in his assessment of open theism. He doesn't necessarily take the John Piper approach, which is, you guys are all heretics. Rather he says, look, there are strengths and weaknesses to this. And that's exactly what I would like you to do in all the positions that are presented in this class. There are strengths and weaknesses, I guarantee you, to every single thing that is presented. And he says, okay, here's the good. It attempts to be biblical. It wants to speak in a contemporary context or to a contemporary context. It reminds evangelicals especially of the influence that Greek philosophy has had on the development of theology. Because sometimes if you don't understand that influence, you just take these things as a given. Well, of course, we've always read the Bible this way, right? When in fact, we've read it through a very particular lens that has been passed down to us through Neoplatonic thinkers and Aristotelian thinkers. So that's important to understand. That doesn't mean always that that's necessarily wrong, but it's something of which we need to be aware, all right? Because some of those things may indeed be extra biblical, okay? And importantly, and I think this is one of the important parts, it relates the doctrine of God to very practical things, such as what happens when we pray. Can I really, let's say that this person was going to die, can I pray over this person, pray for their healing with all of my heart in the hopes that God may be moved by my prayer and that this person may live? That's pretty powerful. And remember, how we think about the doctrine of God, how we think about how God is, has these implications, such as what happens when we pray. I mean, think about the other way that you can look about prayer. If you take some of those more deterministic perspectives, of which, by the way, even Calvinism is not as deterministic as Gordon Clark is in its totality. There's spectrums within Calvinism too. Just want to make sure you understand that, because I don't want to falsely accuse Calvinism of something. Some proponents are more Calvinistic than Calvin. So, but think about this. If you take a highly deterministic viewpoint, then you may end up with, well, prayer isn't to change God. Prayer is there to change me so that I may be in accordance with God's will, right? So, and that may be the way that prayer is another way that prayer is to be understood. But you can see how that's connected with our doctrine of God, and how you can end up with one perspective or you can end up with this other perspective based on who you believe God is and God's self, and then in turn how he relates to his creation. Okay. Dr. Karkanen, our own professor here at Fuller, notes that this was a helpful correction in some ways to some of the deficient aspects of classical theism. And it is a helpful reminder to evangelicals of some of those aspects of classical theism that might be problematic. Now, that's not Dr. Karkanen giving a wholesale approval to open theism. He simply is saying, here are some of the positive elements. Oops, sorry about that. I just accidentally got off that slide. Okay, and all right. But he does see some problems with with open theism as well. And so I'm going to talk about some of those problems. One of them is that he thinks that the open theist agenda, like what happens with some other progressive agendas or movements, tends to be guided too much by either reactionary or apologetic concerns. In other words, and that's not always bad. I mean, because sometimes, it's you look at something, it's in reaction to something that we look at some things deeper. But as in terms of any reactionary movement, we can go too far. We can lose our own perspective. So just to be aware of that is helpful. Open theism's description of classical theism is sometimes not always fair and can sometimes be a caricature, because classical theism has its own nuances, right? You could always go to the extreme of, like, for example, Calvinism, and end up with that highly deterministic perspective. But in fact, the reality is there's a lot of nuanced perspectives that are within that spectrum. And so it's always easier to make a caricature, right? It's easier to say, this, if you land on this extreme determinism, this is how you can respond to it. But when you look at the nuancing of things, when it's less of a caricature, then it, sometimes it's not always as clear cut. All right, so fair enough. I think the next criticism that has sometimes been leveled at open theism isn't really fair, and I'll explain why. It is that open theism is too aligned with process theism. I don't think so. It may be that in terms of this more dynamic notion and the fact that the future is partially open and all of that, they share some characteristics with process theism. But there is a big difference between saying that the reason why it's partially open is because God in his sovereignty has created things to be this way. So rather than saying this is inherent to God's character, or sorry, to God's nature, that he has this impotence. Like that impotence is part of who God is. That's not what open theism is saying. No, God is all powerful, but he has chosen to exercise his power in this way. So I don't think, honestly, that is a fair criticism. And I don't say that. I don't give the critique of the critique, but I thought that's one criticism I thought needed to have an answer put to it. All right. I think at the end of the day, open theism is much more concerned with remaining within the guardrails, and process theism is like, let's just go over the edge. That's fine. It's like Thelma and Louise, just go. But if you don't know the reference, that's okay. All right. Some other criticisms: that open theism, in looking at the Bible, relies too much on things like biblical orientations or the big picture, and may miss some of the trees that are actually in the forest there. Some criticize open theism for being too selective in its reading and too broadly sweeping. Although, frankly, I see selective reading happening on all sides of these issues. One of the consequences that we did not get into, which is a big consequence in terms of open theism, is the issue of theodicy. That is, why does suffering happen? Why does God allow suffering to happen? And open theism thinks that in this idea of this much more dynamic understanding of God, seems to answer that question of theodicy better, they think, than classical theism does. I'm not sure that's 100% true. That's the case. And because we still have to account for God's intervention in his creation. Because remember, their perspective isn't that he's 100% hands off. So I'm not sure that at the end of the day, you might have a little bit more dynamic understanding of why there's suffering in the world. Not simply God wills the suffering, which is where you can end up on extreme determinism. But a more nuanced version of Calvinism and a more nuanced version of open theism might actually be much more close together than it may appear from these kinds of ways that we've been looking at this. All right. There is one more criticism, and I think this was actually from Dr. Karkanen, and that is, does in fact open theism put too much weight now on human initiative? I mean, remember, as we are going to start to look at Karl Barth later on, one of his big things is to become too anthropocentric, where we're looking too much at what it is that we do rather than what it is that God is doing. And that's a genuine concern. and it's one that I don't know that there's an easy answer to, because we are constantly negotiating how God acts in the world with how it is that we respond and act in that kind of ongoing dance that we have with Him. And are the, you know, anyway, are those steps predetermined, or is it more um, improvisational? Well, that's up to you to explore. I've only given you the framework for one response, and it is an evangelical response, which is why I chose it. And it's also perhaps one of the more, like I said, responses that is pushing the envelope a little bit. But I think in doing that, it brings out a lot of the questions in a way that if I'd explored a different position, may not have been able to kind of pull some of the threads that I wanted to pull. So I hope that helps you in some way as you go through your readings, and I look forward to the next lecture with you. Thank you.